What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the Curse Discussions podcast. I think this is episode 8 now. Once again, I am your host, I suppose, Chucky R. Law. With me today, we have Utility Maximizer, or Max for short. We've got Gleason and Sean Last. And we're here to talk about economics in this episode. So we're going to cover a pretty wide range of topics. So sort of running the gauntlet on different things that are interesting, as well as some topical stuff. So to start us off, actually, first of all, why don't we go around, everyone, introduce yourself.
I am Sean Last. I make YouTube videos, and I'm an internet racist.
Okay.
I'm Max. I run the blog Profit Maximizer on Tumblr.
I'm Gleason, and I'm interested in rates of profit.
Okay. Well, we'll have plenty of time to talk about that. But before we get into rates of profit or anything any kind of esoteric Marxianism or Rothbardianism, as it were. First of all, I think it might be interesting to talk about something that's been very topical recently, and that's free trade, right? Because Trump recently has come out blunt. Like the racist he is, he's been pushing some tariffs recently, and particularly on steel and aluminum. And obviously, Canada, Mexico, and the European Union are sort of threatening to retaliate. I think the European Union is cooking up some stuff with the WTO. And there's a lot of debate about how this will impact the American economy. I think it's sort of interesting how the center left has come down now. I think they were probably leaning at least slightly towards free trade before, but now that Trump kind of took a stance against free trade, they've now decisively come out in favor of free trade, which I guess is good, although it's kind of eye-rolling. But that brings up the point of the economic impact of free trade. So does anyone have... it seems to be the consensus of the economic consensus that free trade is generally a good thing. Does anyone have a contrary view?
I probably feel more ambivalent about it, I guess, than most people do. Although, if I had to come down on one side, that is the side I would come down on.
Okay, and why? Go ahead.
So one thing to say is that the tariffs and the like. Well, there are two things. One, to my surprise, Trump's tariff thing with China seemingly kind of worked out in that he put tariffs or threatened to put tariffs on China, and this caused them to respond in a way so as to increase the free trade between the two countries. And that's more of a strategic thing, but that surprised me that seemingly worked. But then in the second place, free trade seemingly impacts sexes differently in that the sorts of jobs, which are better jobs on average than manufacturing jobs, but the sorts of jobs which have replaced manufacturing jobs in the United States as the result of free trade have disproportionately been jobs that women are well suited for as opposed to men. Obviously, in all cases, we're mostly talking here about low-skilled people. And there's an argument to be had that having low-skilled women unemployed is not as societally bad of a thing as is having unskilled men be unemployed. I don't really know what to make of that in terms of how important that is or anything like that, but it's something I've heard people say that is not wildly implausible, I guess.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So that would sort of be a social effect, which you could argue might temper the positive effects, the positive pure economic effects in terms of material well-being that are brought on by free trade.
But potentially, and also, I mean, economically, there's a difference because, at least in theory, women, right, if they can't get a job, they can get a husband. It doesn't really work the other way around. So it might be, I don't know if this is true or not, this is an empirical question, but it may be that when men can't get a job, they're more likely to end up on welfare or something like this than are women.
Mm-hmm. So are you saying that we should have sugar mommies then?
Yes, that is obviously the intention behind what I meant the whole time.
Okay. Well, it is kind of interesting how free trade seems to be one of those issues that seems to argue basically for some sort of technocracy, at least from a libertarian point of view, and argue sort of against populism, since there's a pretty big disconnect where most of the experts, seem to come on down on the libertarian side of things, whereas the masses, like, by and large, don't. Like, I don't think free trade is very popular. I mean, actually, interestingly, it might be getting more popular because Blumf is against it. But I mean, we'll leave the politics out of it is a little bit here.
I think that it's sort of the free trade thing relates to maybe a broader economic question about, because there's like one of the things that people don't understand, but I don't mean economists, I mean sort of random people sometimes don't understand, is that the actual manufacturing output in the United States has increased as we've lost manufacturing jobs due to the increase of efficiency of the technology involved. Mm-hmm. But that then leaves a question of what to do with a growing number of especially young males that are seemingly not fit necessarily for the economy. And that's not only a social question, but also probably an important economic question as well that doesn't have an obvious, easy answer.
Sure. Gleason, Max, anything to add?
Well, I don't think you have to necessarily assume that people will be permanently unemployed. It's more of a question of what kind of jobs will they find in the future. I mean, because I don't think anybody argues that free trade is good because it makes stuff cheaper at the cost of increasing unemployment. I think people would say that it makes stuff cheaper at the cost of making some industries poorer and some richer. But on that, it's the consumer that wins.
Right. What's that called? Frictional unemployment or something? I don't know. I don't know economics.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, frictional.
Yes, but it's, I mean, how clear is it, though, that there aren't some group of people who, through the mechanisms of free trade, and again, I think free trade is on net an economically good thing regardless, but that some people have left the labor force for a longer period than you would normally associate with frictional unemployment. It's a bit hard to tease out causality here because a lot of things are going on, but in the United States anyway, right, among very unskilled males, there's been an increase over the decades, a quite large increase in the proportion of working age males that are simply not involved in labor at all. Which is involved in a lot of things, but one of the things people say is that they used to have these pretty good paying jobs that are readily available given the skills that males naturally have in terms of physical attributes that now aren't available, and as a result they'd have to invest more, especially in cognitive ability, in order to compete in the economy. They can't do this, and the sorts of jobs that have replaced those manufacturing jobs have been customer service jobs that are much more, that in some cases, like in the case of waiting tables, for instance, can pay well above the minimum wage, but are more well suited for the average female, and therefore this is some sort of impact on the long-term unemployment of young males in the unskilled population.
That's interesting because I would say that like, I guess you could argue that something like waiting tables is more suited to the average female, but it seems like there's a lot of jobs in that sort of genre, right? Like minimum wage type jobs that would maybe be about equally suited to males and females, or possibly even slightly more suited to males that are still available. And one might think that if this hypothesis were true, that we might see like more and more people like dropping out of the workforce in tougher economic times. But I'm not sure, is that actually true? Like it seems like we've seen like a long-term trend of people leaving the labor force, even which continues to this day when the economy is improving quite a bit, including adding jobs in that sort of low skill genre, which I think some men would be quite good at.
Yes, I don't know if there have been sort of bumps in the trend during like recessions and this sort of thing. One thing to say though is that when we talk about factory jobs, right, the reason why I brought up waiting is because waiting tables is something that if you're decent at anyway, you can make well above the minimum wage. So like a lot of minimum wage jobs, it's like literally stock stuff that aren't like this. But that factory jobs, at least as people remember them, were paid significantly above the minimum wage. I think people overestimate the degree to which factory jobs were paid above the minimum wage, but they were paid somewhat above the minimum wage. Mm-hmm. So waiting seems to be one of the most accessible examples of something today that you can do with very low, like near zero skill that makes well above the minimum wage. The factory thing seems less common, although it's still, it's still around. It depends on the part of the country.
That's true. a factory worker is kind of comparable to like a waiter in the sense that they can both do like all right, whereas someone who just like works at Party City and talks about conspiracy theories a lot probably is not doing as well.
Yes, they'll probably never end up, making enough income to not kill themselves by the time they're 30.
Yeah, that's probably correct. But anyway, let's change topics and shift gears a little bit, if we might. This is another topic in macroeconomics that I thought is sort of funny. I know macroeconomics is a little bit Jewish, but how much do deficits matter? Are they worth less than fecal matter? Like I remember seeing some studies, right, or that found that there was just like there was a correlation between corporate taxes, right? Like a high corporate tax rate generally means bad things for economic growth. They found that there was a mild negative correlation between running a high deficit, or I can't actually remember, and this is probably an important distinction. I can't remember if it was the deficit itself or if it was just the accumulated debt. But either way, there was some sort of negative correlation between that and economic growth. Although interestingly, I think it was less than a lot of different taxes. I think it even was probably less than the individual income tax, which to me sort of implies that it would be a good policy decision on the part of the state to run a debt. I mean, like, even if running a deficit does have some mild negative effects, if the choice is between, increasing taxes and running a deficit, you should, basically just choose run a deficit.
Well, so the debt to GDP ratio has most research finds it as a non-linear relationship with growth, such that in a more moderate range of debt to GDP ratios, increases aren't going to have a big effect on growth. But somewhere around the most commonly cited figure is around 90%, that going above that has a fairly large negative effect on economic growth. It seems like putting your debt to GDP ratio above that might decrease a country's growth rate by something like 1.5%, which obviously is quite a lot over the long run. That's what most of the. I was recently looking at some empirical literature about this sort of thing, and that's what most of it seems to indicate to me. There was a funny story back in 2010. There was this paper released that claimed that the average growth rate of countries with debt to GDP ratios above 90% over about 100-year period of the data they looked at in about 40 countries, that it was as low as -0.2 compared to something like 3% for countries of lesser debt to GDP ratios. And there's a big controversy about that. And it turned out
this is the Reinhardt-Rogoff thing. Is this what you're talking about? Yes,
exactly, the Reinhardt-Rogoff paper. And there was some somewhat embarrassing coding errors found in that paper in terms of how they did the spreadsheet. There were some autistic arguments about how you weight different things in the statistics. But it became a weird debate because it was as if those who were correcting this paper were saying that the growth did not have an effect. But in fact, the figure that I cited before, suggesting that it causes a decrease in growth of something like 1 to 1.5%, is based on these sort of papers arguing that the case against debt is much lesser than Reinhardt and Rogoff made it out to be, which in the public, and aided by people who know better, like Paul Krugman, somehow this was perceived as them saying that the debt didn't matter at all to growth, which obviously a decrease of, say, 1% in growth actually matters quite a good deal.
Did they identify the mechanism that is supposed to inhibit growth, or is it just an empirical trend?
Well, I don't know what the specific mechanism is by which it does inhibit growth, but one thing obviously they checked for through a variety of empirical strategies is to make sure that it is not simply that those countries which are facing harsh economic conditions to begin with grow debt because of those harsh economic conditions. Like this isn't a recession effect, something like that. So that sort of plausible alternative story has been ruled out in the empirical literature, but to my knowledge anyway, that's not something that's been fleshed out and decisively shown in terms of the mechanism. And as you know, I'm less interested in the mechanism anyway. That's very hard to get at, whereas the effect of policy is easier to get at, I think.
How very positivist.
And that kind of brings up, if I can sort of shift this topic a little bit further, sort of an underlying debate in economics, or I'm not sure how much of a debate it is, but basically it's the role of like empiricism in economics, and the role of a priori reasoning, right, and to what extent there is one. Obviously, in like a lot of libertarian political circles, I'm a libertarian. Quite a lot of people are interested in Austrian economics, and therefore are more inclined to be very favorable towards a priori economic reasoning, and sort of skeptical of arguments that rely very heavily on empiricism without attempting to identify a mechanism. But it's not just the Austrians. The Austrians are extremely like gung-ho on the anti-empiricism thing, but there's other like tendencies there too, right? Like there's people, I understand that there's some sort of tension between mathematical modeling in economics, which sometimes clashes with empiricism. I don't know, do you guys have anything to say about that?
That's true, but I think the tide has significantly turned on that. So that if you look back in the 80s, for instance, and then there's empirical literature looking at just the sorts of articles that are published in economics journals. So back in the 80s, the majority, maybe it was the 70s, but back then, in that time period, the vast majority of papers that were being published were these sort of theoretical and especially simulation papers in macroeconomics. And that over time, it has very much moved in the other direction. And so that now the majority of stuff being published is empirically based. And the economics has become, I think, somewhat better in the way they try to do empirical and statistically minded stuff. I think with the Austrians, like their praxeological method, I think today is kind of silly, but I think it was somewhat understandable. I mean, Mises must have been thinking about these sorts of things back in the 1910s. That period, that's when sort of modern statistics is not fully even fleshed out yet. I doubt. I'm not even sure if it was invented, and I would be improbable for Mises to know what a multiple regression was. Things like this. So I think it's more understandable in that context, but to carry it on to today seems very strange to me.
And I would say not only were like the actual statistical methods harder to access, but I think if I understand correctly, also just the data itself was not as available.
Yes, yeah, that's very true.
And actually carrying out the analysis, I mean, there was no calculators.
No.
You had to do log tables. Like even a single statistical analysis would take extremely long.
This is kind of a point Brian Kaplan makes, right? That like basically a lot of the good work that Austrians have historically done has sort of been incorporated into just like mainstream neoclassical economics, and especially like a lot of stuff like that Hayek worked on with price theory. Mm-hmm. It's a good example.
I mean, it seems like the Austrians, with their praxeological stuff, though, they make it out to be more rigorous and austere than it actually is. That they make it out as if they're going to derive this in the way that like Spinoza has a famous philosophical work where he tries to derive philosophical ideas through a method of proof analogous to what you might see in math. And they act as if they're going to do that when they talk about their method. At least some Austrians do. But if you actually read any Austrian text, like it does not actually, it's not formed that way. It doesn't actually follow that close of a deductive process. It ends up being more like just what you would imagine if people were trying to reasonably, logically argue about different things with maybe a hyper-awareness of the fact that what they're saying, caring more about what they say follows logically rather than whether or not their premises are substantiated in reality.
Now, if I can defend Austrians for a minute here, though, I would say that it should be noted that economics is probably one of the most difficult social sciences to actually apply empiricism to, just because of the fact that you really can't do a completely controlled experiment. Now, you can compensate for this with like longitudinal stuff, right? But you can't really, you can't design like an experiment specifically, with all the controls and everything, whereas you can in like psychology, for example. And I think that makes it so that perhaps it is a little bit warranted. I mean, to varying degrees, obviously, like, a season for all things, to have some sort of skepticism of empirical findings that just have like really weird results and no identifiable mechanism.
Certainly weird results, definitely, right? Because you always have to incorporate new evidence into your prior probability estimate there. In a way, it is unfortunate, because what you say is true, that it is harder to do statistics in economics, and in an ideal world where incentives weren't real, what you would want to happen then is that economists would go out of their way to try to do empiricism in the most rigorous way of all the social sciences. Because it's so hard, they better be doing it as carefully as humanly possible. But of course, what happened until recently was that instead, understandably, this caused them to shy away from even trying. And it's been somewhat alleviated by the fact that governments these days just collect so much data, like, time series data just started appearing, and then economists figured out what to do with it eventually. But the level of, what really speaks to this, I think, one thing that does is the level of argument that occurs in macroeconomics about how to measure things, right? Very, very simple, very fundamental things, like what is the best measure of inflation and price levels and growth. These things are all controversial, even though they're the most basic measures that you have to start with before you can do an analysis of anything.
I think we should also maybe distinguish between the views of Rothbard and the views of Hayek, because it seems to me that Rothbard's view took this kind of extreme view that we tend to describe as being the Austrian view, which is the view that you can start from certain premises and kind of deduce everything. And that was kind of Rothbard's take on empiricism, that you can kind of know things. Whereas I think Hayek had maybe a slightly weaker, but I'm not exactly sure if Hayek actually shared Rothbard or Mises's view that you could deduce certain fundamental truths about the economy.
You can look at the Mises Institute people, and they oftentimes kind of shit on Hayek, right? And talk about how he's basically a cuck, right? Yeah,
I mean, he was literally a neoliberal in his life. But
I also think it's quite interesting how it seems like a lot of, this is probably what this actually is to counter signal the Mises Institute people, and since the Mises Institute is right wing. And they shit on Hayek. I think a lot of left libertarians, self-identified left libertarians, sort of identify with Hayek now. They kind of like Hayek, but that's sort of weird in itself, right? Because Milton Friedman gets so much crap for supporting Pinochet or whatever, advising Pinochet is the Chicago Boys. Yeah, okay. But Milton Friedman, if you look at it, was very measured, right, in anything he said about Chile. Like he went out of his way to say it's not, obviously, dictatorships are bad. Whereas Hayek did not make those caveats. He just openly praised Pinochet and talked about how great the regime was.
Yeah, he has this passage where he talks about it would be better to have a liberal dictatorship than an illiberal democracy. And I think pretty much everybody knew which illiberal dictatorship he was talking about.
Let's be honest, Hayek was based.
But what I wanted to go back was Hayek's views on empiricism, which I think his view was, if I understand it, was, if you say have a situation in physics where you have, you can write down maybe the equation of the system as being one variable as a function of a few others. But his view was, but if you were to try to translate that to economics, you have variables like prices, and if you wanted to, if you take the neoclassical or Austrian view just completely as face value, this price is a function of all the preferences of the consumers in the economy, all the technologies available, all the knowledge that each person possesses, and so on. And so even if there is an equation that relates the two, it's not really discoverable, and it's so complex. Well, even if you could write it down, you wouldn't be able to actually fill in the unknowns. So like in physics, you can write down an equation, and you can say, this is my model, and you can try to fill in the unknowns and get a prediction. But the point is that the fundamental aspects of of an economic model are, on the one hand, technology, which is really an aspect of people's knowledge, and their preferences, and those are really not accessible. So even if the model is exactly true, it's extremely difficult to test, because they're it's the actual variables of the model are outside of view. And in a kind of strange way, this actually relates to his critique of central planning, because his critique of central planning is that the central planner does not have access to all this information that makes the market operate. And if economists really could make predictions, then in a way they would have solved the calculation problem, because the calculation problem is the process is the problem of acquiring all this information. And if a central body could acquire all this information, then it could somehow simulate markets and just kind of solve the calculation problem like that. So in a kind of strange way, the two arguments are kind of joined.
Do you know what Hayek would say about this notion that today a lot of empirical literature in economics doesn't make any attempt to measure something like the preferences of everyone or something like this, but rather there's an awful lot of literature just trying to directly empirically tease out the efficacy of different policies. And seemingly from that thing, you could engage in a kind of central planning depending on the policies being tested. Do you know what his sort of, I guess, economic epistemology would have to say about something like that?
I'm not entirely sure what Hayek would say. I mean, a lot of actual models that theorists come up with make, very extreme assumptions, like all consumers have the same preferences, or, all firms, have the same technology, which is kind of a bit of a kind of a way of avoiding the whole problem, the whole calculation. Because in some ways, the whole calculation problem is kind of bound up in the heterogeneous nature of the world. Because if everything was the same, then it'd be quite easy to solve the calculation problem. Because you'd only just have to look at the preferences of one individual, and everybody's preferences. So maybe he's looking at it more from the point of view of testing models. But there seems like a lot of empirical work in economics. I'm not sure to what extent it actually tries to test theoretical models, as opposed to just looking at, these vouchers, does this voucher scheme work? How much do people respond to such and such an incentive?
But yes, exactly. And I guess what I'm saying is that because there's an awful lot of empirical literature today that does not even make its business looking into abstract theoretical models, it seemingly that would be a sort of route of empirical, potentially depending on what the data said, that would be potentially a route of empirical justification of central planning that at first glance might sound like the sort of thing Hayek was complaining about, but actually his critique would not apply to.
I don't think so, because his critique is about being able to plan the economy in the detail. Is it possible for a central body to be able to plan the economy in the detail successfully?
I guess it's going to hinge then on how we define like a planner planning the economy in detail.
Because the thing is, Hayek was not opposed to environmental regulations. I mean, really, in Hayek in the middle of his life, in like the mid-century, was a neoliberal. He was somebody who was very pro-market, but that's not the same thing as being pro-laissez-faire. I mean, it was really Milton Friedman who was the real laissez-faire one. And so that's why Hayek placed so much emphasis on defending markets rather than defending, complete laissez-faire. So, if you've got a policy that, that tries to achieve a result but doesn't try to plan people's behavior in detail, then I don't think it would be subject to the calculation problem.
What would you say something that like wait, I guess I'm not exactly sure. I guess what the planning would have to mean. Like there's a sense in which, say, sin taxes, prohibition, so-called nudges, right? Nudge policies. These things have as their direct goal actual behavior, but they don't make any weird assumptions about trying to measure things that can't be measured either, though.
Yeah, I don't know.
I'm not entirely sure, but I would say that the nudge stuff is probably not subject to the calculation problem. So I'm not sure Hayek would critique it in that sense.
Well, there are libertarians on the internet who who don't know that. But okay.
People have a very odd understanding of the calculation problem because I've definitely spoken with people who believe that the calculation problem and the information problem, which I just described that Hayek identified as separate. But in my opinion, it seems to me that one of Hayek's great insights is seeing the two problems are the same. Because if you could in principle solve the information problem, then you have all these economic equations that tell you how markets are supposed to behave, and you could just, if you had the computational power, you could just substitute those unknowns into the equations, and you can in principle just completely, quote unquote, simulate markets. So, yeah.
Yeah, so just like, how the Germans play truck simulator, all day, the German Ordo liberals could play market simulator, and then they wouldn't have to rely on markets.
Touche.
In any case, though, this is a really great back and forth, but I would like to bring Gleason in here. You've been awfully quiet this whole time. You still awake, Gleason?
Yes.
Okay.
I don't have too much to add to this discussion.
All right. Well, let me ask you about something that I think you do probably know a little bit about, which is value theory, right? I know that you're kind of into Marxian economics, and this is something where I think that this is one of the biggest flare up points where this hasn't happened so much recently, but I remember several years ago, maybe in 2012 and 13 or something, there were all these big fights between mainly Austrian ANCAPs and Marxians and also some anarcho-communists who had if not Marxian economics, at least accepted the labor theory of value, basically classical economics, right? Of the kind where I think Benjamin Tucker accepted classical economics. One of the big flare-up points there is the labor theory of value in that whole debate. What do you think about that? What do you think about the labor theory of value?
Well, I think one of the problems with talking about the labor theory of value is a lot of people think they know what that means, but really don't.
The mud
so
pies
for example,
thing?
Yeah, so the mud pie example is a famous straw man, and it's one that Marx, right, explicitly points out that this is not what he's saying.
Isn't that in the first chapter of Capital or something?
It's in Capital. I don't remember which chapter it's in, but so Marx and the other supporters of the labor theory of value are not claiming that if you work hard to make something, then you need to be paid equal to how much effort you put into it, right? Their argument is that in equilibrium, right, it's going to have to be the case that the average amount of labor required to produce a commodity is going to determine the value that it has, though this is somewhat complicated later by the transformation problem, but we can get into that later.
Yes, well, the transformation problem was solved, you see, by the Soviets or something. I don't know. This is what Marxists that I've talked to say. But I do want to talk about that then. So is there empirical evidence about this, about what the relationship is between, labor, as an input good to the value of a commodity, right? Do we have evidence on it? We need to look at the data.
Well, I know that there is a paper called something like the 98 or 97% labor theory of value, which tries to show how closely prices do track the amount of labor that's put into it.
Uh-huh.
But I'm not too confident. I don't know too much about that paper, so I can't comment too much.
I've heard of a paper by a similar name by George Stigler. Is this the paper you're talking about?
It might be.
Because I don't think that was an empirical paper, if I remember. It was basically saying that I think Stigler was trying to characterize Ricardo's views on the labor theory of value, and say that actually Ricardo did not believe in a true labor theory of value. He believed in a kind of empirical labor theory of value, where basically kind of labor and capital would tend to be in fixed proportions, throughout, 90% of the economy or something like that. And that would tend to lead to a very high agreement with the labor theory of value or something like that. But
that didn't actually
I don't think it was
have
empirical paper.
Right, an empirical verification of that. Although, something that's interesting. This is something I never quite was able to wrap my mind around, but it's a concept that was sort of hinted at. Like, do you guys know anything about the relationship between the shape of a supply curve and like value theory? Because as I understand it, there's some evidence, which is empirical, to suggest that at least in the long term, and for it kind of varies depending on what like actual good we're producing here, but that for most stuff, at least in the long term, the supply curves tend to actually be flat rather than in the neoclassical model. It's not. So the point is that we were talking about like flat justice, just like a lolicon hentai. How is this related to value theory? Is this evidence of the labor theory of value?
Should I answer that?
If you have an answer.
I do, yes. So in my opinion, in my humble view, the two are not related. I can show how, I can kind of explain how they are related, but there's no particular reason why you can have any particular shape of supply curve in the subjective theory of value. The subjective theory of value doesn't necessarily require any particular shape. I mean the thing with the subjective theory of value, if I can just give kind of a background on what's wrong with the labor theory of value, I think somehow, I think it originates with Adam Smith, and what he said was that, the true cost of anything is the time and trouble you put into acquiring it, which seems kind of intuitive when you state it like that. But when you think about, what does cost mean? Well, he means some kind of disutility or displeasure. But disutility or displeasure relative to what? Because kind of, absolute, pain in an absolute sense does not really have economic significance. Because when you make a decision, if you're being rational, then what you do is you look at how much is, how much utility is A relative to B. You don't think about the utility of A or B in an absolute sense. It's only, which has more utility and which has less. So if you could wave a wand, and make everybody's utility of everything go up, that would kind of be economically meaningless because it wouldn't actually change the differential utility of any choices. So disutility or dissatisfaction in an absolute sense can't really have economic significance. And so, but what does have economic significance is opportunity costs. So you can say that whenever you choose something, you have to give something up. So really, the disutility of labor is, on the one hand, the enjoyment you could be having by not working, but it's also the opportunity cost of applying that labor in that particular application, because labor could be applied to all other parts of the economy. So ultimately, cost is just kind of a particular instance of value. This is kind of what's wrong with the labor theory of value way of looking at things, and it can kind of lead to these slightly fallacious ways of thinking. Like, for instance, if you're like a lender and you're collecting interest, well, then it may seem like you're not doing any labor. Well, of course you aren't, but then the neoclassical will come along and say, well, actually, there's an opportunity cost because you have to defer consumption, and Marxists would just scoff at that. But of course, since opportunity cost is the only kind of real cost, being slightly less happy is economically, just as significant as being, unhappy. So there's just as much sense in which lending money is a kind of labor, because you have to make an opportunity cost of deferring consumption. And so thinking of cost or displeasure in absolute terms does lead to kind of fallacies, which the subjective theory avoids. But in a sense, ultimately, these kind of costs are ultimately determined by values, because when you apply labor in one situation, the opportunity cost is, whatever that labor will produce in another situation. But of course, that is itself determined by values. If you're producing, if you want to apply labor to guns versus butter, well, there's a subjective value of both guns and butter appears in the cost of guns versus the cost of butter. So if you produce a certain amount of guns, or if you apply more labor to producing guns, well, the opportunity cost is you have to produce less butter, but of course the value of that is subjectively determined. So these costs are not objective things, but are kind of subsumed into subjective value theory. So this is, in my opinion, why subjective value theory is correct and labor theory of value is wrong. I think with regard to supply curves are an interesting problem because actually this is kind of an interesting historical point, but a lot of 19th century economists were quite aware of the fact that firms generally seem to have economies of scale. They seem to have decreasing costs. And of course, the supply curve is really just a cost curve. So if costs are diminishing, the supply curve should be decreasing. And so how do you resolve that? And Alfred Marshall had this idea that you had a kind of life cycle of the firm where firms would appear, they would grow and become successful. And as they would grow, they would experience diminishing costs. But somehow other forces would eventually bring those firms down. And this way you could have stable competition all the while you had economies of scale. And I think in the 20s, I forget exactly what the arguments were made, but I think in the 20s, there was a series of articles basically just completely shitting on Marshall's idea. Because, I don't know, I think people found that it kind of mixed assumptions. Like you assume that all firms are identical. But, if you assume that all firms are identical, then this kind of life cycle of the firm idea doesn't really work. If you assume the product is completely homogeneous and stuff like this. So I think one of Marshall's problems was that he tried to be as realistic as possible, and that meant that he kind of would often contradict his own assumptions within his argument. But there was a series of articles by a range of interesting people, such as Frank Knight, Jacob Viner, Joan Robinson, and Piero Sraffa, all on this topic, and Lionel Robbins. Basically, we're talking about this issue of supply curves. And I think Viner put together this article where he talked about, well, theoretically, okay, if we're supposed to have perfect competition and it's meant to be stable, what kind of things should we assume? And his basic idea was that you just have kind of diminishing technological returns that would tend to cause increasing costs at the level of the firm. And those increasing costs at the level of the firm would basically maintain stable competition. And I think there's a line in the article where he says, this is not meant to be realistic. This is just supposed to be, what you would need to assume for perfect competition to kind of be internally consistent. But it seems kind of odd that people have taken that article, which was really just supposed to be, what would you have to assume to make perfect competition consistent, and kind of present it in economics textbooks as this is how firms actually behave, which obviously it's not. I think Sraffa had a very interesting article talking about this, and he also, along with all the others, criticized Marshall. One of the arguments that Marshall made for the increasing supply curve was that as the firms experience increasing demand, they would need to hire more capital, hire more labor. And what that would do was that they would increase the demand for capital and labor, and it would just push up wages and rents and so on, which seems like a nice argument. But the problem is, right at the beginning of the analysis, Marshall says, okay, we're going to assume an industry that's small relative to the size of the economy, because unless we assume that, things get very horrible, complicated. But the thing is that if the industry is small relative to the size of the economy, then it can't be pushing up wages and prices and so on. And so really, you shouldn't have this effect. And I think that was one of the things that Sraffa said, that you shouldn't, if an industry is really small relative to the overall size of the economy, then its supply curve should be, according to Marshall's assumptions, basically flat. Yeah, Sraffa's article is very interesting. And then I think there was another 2 articles by Robinson and Viner, which I think I want to do a blog post about those because it was fascinating. But they gave but both of them gave a similar argument for why actually the supply curve may actually increase even if the industry is small relative to the size of the economy. And the argument was that the rates, if you take, for instance, just for simplicity, that there's only 2 inputs, which are capital and labor, the ratio of those inputs in the rest of the economy is not going to be the same as the ratio in the industry that you're looking at, even if it's small. And so if the industry tries to expand, it will want to draw from the rest of the economy capital and labor in the kind of appropriate proportions that it has for its particular industry. There may be like a certain ratio that's optimal. But the thing is, the rest of the economy may not be releasing those factors of production in that ratio. And as a result, the industry may be pushed towards some kind of suboptimal ratio of capital and labor, which may increase costs. And all of these articles have been, I think, collected into a collection by George Stigler called Readings in Price Theory, and it's very good. I would highly recommend those articles, especially Sraffa's article.
Now that's all very interesting. Now I'd like to hear.
Sorry, I talked a bit.
No, you just hit at a lot of different elements of the question I was asking. But I'd like to hear from Gleason on that topic. Do you believe in some version of the labor theory of value? Is that fair to say, Gleason, or am I mischaracterizing your position?
I would say it's not as clearly false as people think it is.
Okay. All right. Very big-brained of you, measured. But so let me ask you then, Max just gave his explanation of how supply curves could end up being flat or even rising, right, in sometimes, although I think supposedly empirically they're flat. Do you think that there is an explanation that would basically support the labor theory of value for that phenomenon? Or would you just say it's just unrelated?
I don't really think it's particularly related. The classical economists tended to assume that outside of agriculture, there was just like a constant cost of production. And that's what manufacturing meant. But I don't think that's essential to their understanding of value.
Okay.
Oh, we didn't discuss the Amazing Atheist video on the theory of value.
Oh,
it's very sad.
That's funny. Actually, did the Amazing Atheist make a video? I've never even heard of this.
Yes, it was quite something. It was Electrocidad of an economics video.
Was it in response to libertarians attacking him?
I think so. It wasn't. I'm not sure. I don't think it was directed of anyone in particular, but it was the worst economics video I'd ever seen in my life. And the thing is,
what did
I was like a socialist at the time, so it seemed very convincing. But...
What did you say, Sean?
Oh, I made a joke. I asked what the Amazing Atheist had to say about Sraffa's argument.
Oh.
Well, the thing is, the Amazing Atheist took a completely unique view that nobody ever takes, which is he said that value was caused by 3 different sources. Objective value, which he says is a thing, which is just the baseline, food is good because it satisfies hunger. That's objective value. Then there's subjective value, which is, I don't know, you like this, I don't know, the painting because it just kind of, I don't know, it just suits you. And then there's intersubjective value, which is kind of society making you value things like diamonds. And then the value of a thing is just the sum of these three.
It's always so cringy when someone, you can tell they just like sit down and start talking about something, and they just like making up like okay, well here's how it works, right? Like I would consider myself a fan of like Ayn Rand, but I think like that's sort of what people criticize her for, right? Like that's sort of to a much lesser degree, obviously, than the amazing Ayn Rand is way better than the Amazing Atheist, but that's kind of how people like see her in philosophy terms. Although obviously she makes a lot of references to Aristotle, and she doesn't like whatever. But I wanted to sort of move the conversation in along the lines of classical economics and Marxian economics, another sort of topic which we sort of alluded to at the beginning, which is the fallen rate of profit. And I thought it was quite interesting, and this is somewhat obscure, how the fall in the rate of profit is obviously a staple of Marxian economics, and in political Marxism, it sort of is incorporated into the idea of why the downfall of capitalism is ultimately inevitable. But not a lot of people know that Rothbard actually agreed that in, I think, as he put it, like the evenly rotating economy, profit also does tend to zero.
Yeah, but that's not. A very important distinction, though, there is that, as I understand it, Marx and people actually think in the real world the rate of profit will fall in some sense, but Rothbard's evenly rotating economy is an abstract hypothetical concept of what would happen in equilibrium, not something that he ever actually empirically thinks will happen.
Sure.
So that's true, but I think an even more important distinction is that what Rothbard calls profit and what Marx calls profit are two entirely different concepts. Right, so Rothbard's profit is entrepreneurial profit, which is the income someone receives by spotting like an underserved like area where you can like make more money than everybody else. They just like don't see this opportunity, and so he thinks that's what's going to fall to zero in the evenly rotating economy. But he doesn't think that the return to capital is going to fall to zero, or that it even could.
Okay. What's that called? Like economic profit or something?
You could call it, yeah.
Yeah, that's
or
right.
Yeah. Austrians like to call it entrepreneurial profit for, yeah.
It's confusing because the classical economists referred to profit as being the rate of return on capital. So that this tendency to refer to profit as being entrepreneurial profit is a neoclassical thing.
Yes.
Or an Austrian thing, if you want to call it that.
Especially Austrians, right? So the Austrian position is that profits in the ERE are going to be zero, but they don't think that that's going to be the case with return to capital, which they usually call interest.
I see. Interest as in like, deferring consumption.
Yes. So for example, with Marx, he thinks there's an average rate of interest and an average rate of profit. But he famously does not think that these two things are equal, though they are related, in the sense that the upper bound of the rate of interest is the rate of profit.
Really? I didn't know that about Marxism. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes. So Marx thinks that there's a class struggle, but there's not just a class struggle between the laborers and the capitalists, but within the capitalists, there's a distinction between the money capitalists and then the industrial capitalists. So the industrial capitalists are earning profits, but the money capitalists are people that make money by loaning out their money. And so there's an antagonism there because the industrial capitalists are the people that are paying them the money. And so he thinks that the division of the surplus value between the money capitalists and the industrial capitalists depends on the relative power of these two groups.
Huh. That's really interesting. I wondered, this is a little bit off topic, but does he have any ideas about how those interests are represented politically?
I'm sure he does, but I don't know them.
Okay.
Just to follow up on that, there's a book called Finance Capital by the Austro-Marxist Rudolf Hilferding, and that's like particularly what he discusses. So if you're interested in that, that's the book you should read. It was written, I think, in 1910.
Now, I haven't heard of this.
Austro-Marxist.
Yeah, I haven't heard.
That sounds very big brain.
What does Austro-Marxist mean? I assume you mean like the Austrian school and the Marxian school, right?
So Rudolf Hilferding lived in Austria.
Oh, that's what you just literally mean. He's from Austria.
Yeah, so I mean, there is a term, the Austro-Marxists, which were like a school of Marxists that lived in Austria, and so they had like distinct ideas.
That's a very clickbaity term.
So it is kind of related to the Austrian school in the sense that the Austro-Marxists were influenced by von Bawerk. Like they attended to seminars and they wrote replies to him. Yes. That's
funny. I think the Austrian school sort of influenced Marxism more broadly as well, didn't they? Like, I know, what was it? There was some Marxist economist who talked about how, like he spent like he went like out of his way to like refute Mises or something, and said, like Mises should be like deserves an honorable place among socialist economists for like pointing out this problem that we have now solved or something like that.
Yes, that was Otto Bauer, who was an Austro-Marxist.
Ah, yeah, okay. So there we go.
I think he was talking about the calculation problem.
Yes, he was.
Yes, he recommended, I think, they build a statue or a bust to Mises, and like a kind of a snub, but trying to be funny about it.
Now, if I can shift gears here, I did want to talk about, this is sort of a somewhat unrelated topic, which is cost disease, right? Where it's, to anyone who's not familiar with the concept, basically it's just that, you look at the consumer price index, right? Obviously it's increased, over time by some substantial degree, and that's just inflation, right? But it's not even, obviously, right? Like certain goods like increase, but some goods increase like a fucking lot, right? And, right now it's stuff like healthcare, college education, and to some extent, a lesser extent, public school education. There's some infrastructure stuff where basically it's not explained by an increase in the rate of profit. It's not explained by an increase in how much the workers in the industry are getting paid. The quality is not increased, but yet the costs of these things have just increased like hugely, and no one is exactly sure why, and there's different theories. Does anyone have any strong opinions on this?
It's because they're all on Facebook all day.
One thing that libertarians sometimes say is that it has something to do with government involvement.
Sure.
In given industries. I've never seen a rigorous test of that, though. I've seen very anecdotal reasoning. Like the Heritage Foundation points to 5 industries that have grown a lot in terms of price and 5 that have not, or some liberal points to does a similar thing. But I've not seen a sort of systematic analysis whereby there's some measure of government influence in industry and looks at how that relates across a wide range of industries, how that relates to the change in price in the given industry. Unfortunately, it'd be a good thing to know.
Well, I think instead of like a kind of a statistical study, like why don't they just like interview these companies? Like wouldn't that be like way more interesting? Because it's something like really specific. It seems that's driving this that may not be so obvious, like in the kind of macro level data.
So this is something, at least for higher education, right? Which is the traditional explanation, although. Maybe this is not borne out by statistics. I don't really know. Is the idea is basically that because of the government subsidized loans, right, and because college is such an important good, right, like the demand is relatively inelastic, right, and so that means they can basically charge almost however much they want, and they just end up like adding more and more like bullshit, right? So it's not as though this is not going into profit, and it's not going into like wages of professors, which have been, I think, relatively stagnant, at least relative to the price index. But what it is going into is like, adding more like pool halls and, just like random nonsense into like college educations that didn't used to be part of the price.
Well, and interestingly, you could say that the actual quality of the good of education has decreased over that time period. Not only because, of course, in order to allow an increasing number of people into college, you have to make college dumber, which we take for granted. But also in the sense that, sure, professor pay has not changed, but at least not a lot. But that increasingly kids are being taught by people who are not full professors at all, right? So the actual people being hired by the university are increasingly grad students, adjunct professors. So the amount of money, funnily, that schools are actually spending on what is presumably the most important factor in determining the quality of the education has probably decreased. What's going on? I don't know that really speaks to why it's happening. It's just a funny or regrettable fact that accompanies it.
Well, Sean, do you know whether or not some of this money that is perhaps being funneled away from buying like full-time professors, and also, which is going into the dramatically increasing price of tuition, do you know if any of that money is just being funneled into a lot of just like kind of random luxury nonsense, as the narrative that I was kind of sketching out would suggest? Is there any empirical
I've
evidence
seen
on that?
things suggesting that teaching bureaucrats at schools are not only getting paid more, but more importantly, are much more numerous. Which I think anyone who's been to college in recent years knows there are a large number of non-professorial bureaucrats involved in schools these days. I don't know about. I've never seen empirical data on, but intuitively, which isn't worth much, it would seem probable that just renovating buildings and these sorts of things, or building more buildings, or things like that aren't necessary, might contribute to it. But it is a funny thing, because you see this in several other, like in medicine is analogous, right? Where the actual salary of doctors is not increasing, at least not in a way that explains much at all the increase in price in healthcare. So it seems, at least that those two, and these are probably the two most talked about examples of cost disease, that what's going on is not simply that the people most directly involved or associated with the actual work are getting paid a lot more, which makes it seem somewhat mysterious.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a friend that worked for some time at the student union at my university, and I was talking with Sean about this, and it just seems to be like this giant racket to basically provide cushy jobs to people. Like, they're not even that interested in running a proper business. It's literally just, I can get my friend or my relative into this like easy as fuck job where you just sit around in an office, browse on Facebook, do fuck all, and you actually get paid a salary.
Well, that's interesting, but I will point out that I don't think cost disease is at least nearly as much of a problem for universities in the United Kingdom as it is in the U.S.
Yeah, I know, but I'm suggesting maybe that's where it's all going.
Okay.
Just like cushy bureaucrat jobs. And the thing is, these people may not only have to pay their salaries, but they may actually slow down the process of getting things done.
That's an interesting.
So actually have a cost that's larger than their salary.
Yeah, potentially.
To put a little spin on it, this is something when you say, people are increasingly like they're taking loans, more people, there's a much bigger demand, and that's partly driving up the cost of education, right? And that's largely, a good deal of the people that take loans out are people that end up not actually graduating college to begin with, and these are largely black people in the United States anyway, that take on very large amounts of college debt and then end up just failing out of the classes anyhow. And thus, the cost disease, at least in the case of education, may be somewhat related to sort of social egalitarian dogmas and things like this.
Well, yeah, that is one interesting spin. Another thing I wanted to say was that it seems as though, we talked about how, like, the libertarian narrative is governments subsidizing like higher education with loans and stuff, and maybe that's particularly picked up on by demographic groups that are, for ideological reasons, are encouraged to shoot above their ability. But it also seems interestingly analogous to another industry which has rampant cost disease, which is healthcare, because we know that in healthcare it's sort of similar to education, right? Rather than having like a socialized system like Europore countries, what in the U.S. and in Freedom Land, the government still subsidizes a large portion of the actual cost, right? But it's not like socialized. It's just paid to the doctors. Basically poor people like can't pay for their fucking checkups. They don't have insurance, whatever it is, and the government just essentially foots the bill. And it's sort of similar to student loans, right? So it seems like there's an analogy there, which that might go some part of the way to explaining cost disease. I don't know.
In the case of healthcare, right, that seemingly has an awful lot to do with medical technology, and the profit rates of medical technology companies are extremely high, suggesting this one interpretation of that is that it's suggesting a pretty uncompetitive market in the U.S., or at least something weird is going on. The profit rates in some years in the medical technology stuff is completely ridiculous relative to what normally goes on in the economy.
As I understand it, that's like related to the United States, like basically subsidizing the medical research of other countries by having a hugely disproportionate amount of medical research done here because the profit rates are so high.
Yes, it is related in that way, but it's not clear. It's not clear why the profit rate should be so high. I mean, there are some reasons about it.
Has it actually risen?
Insurance.
Because I know that the profit rate.
No,
I don't think the profit rate for hospital. I remember seeing something at like hospitals, at least themselves, the profit rate has remained static despite the increasing cost.
No, the profit rates for medical technology, which is not the same as hospitals, I believe have decreased somewhat, but they're still huge. I mean, back in the 90s, there's some data suggesting that their profit rate was at like 25, 26, 27% on average.
Yeah. That makes Kevin from Shark Tank very happy. But I'll say this, though. If we're talking about, profits decreasing from like a high point at the 90s, or rate of profit decreasing from a high point in the 90s, that still seems weird and not entirely a satisfactory explanation, since obviously healthcare costs have substantially risen since the 90s.
Yeah, well, it's surely not the only reason. I mean, one of the most obvious reasons, right, is that nowadays we spend a ton of money on late in life care, trying to make people live an extra year or two, and this often is some of the most expensive medical care that exists. And then even earlier on in life, you just would go to the doctor a lot more. But you have this very interesting experiments, right, on natural experiments on Medicaid, where you find that being covered by Medicaid makes poor people go to the doctor a lot more, but seemingly does not have a positive benefit on any objective measure of their physical health, which is a pretty damning thing for certain viewpoints.
Medicare BTFO. I do want to bring Gleason back into this real quick, because we talked about how, at least in the case of medical technology companies, their rate of profit has declined substantially since the 90s. So I'm wondering, do you think that is evidence of a Marxian view?
I don't think that's necessarily very strong evidence, because it's one particular firm, and it seems to have one particular sector, and it seems to have abnormally high profits, and I don't know why that is.
Okay.
Well, to be fair, it is true that over the last 60 or 70 years or so, as I understand it, the rate of corporate profit in the United States overall has like somewhat linearly declined with time.
That's probably because we're approaching the evenly rotating economy.
Well, no, because that would again, it's a different profit.
Okay. I mean, well, wait a minute. So obviously, entrepreneurial profit is different from like the rate of return or whatever. Fine, but if one is declining, the other is probably declining also, or at least it goes. I don't know if it works in reverse, but as
the Austrians understand entrepreneurial profit, like there is no rate of entrepreneurial profit.
Oh, I just don't know what I'm talking about then.
Well, so entrepreneurial profit is like if you notice, hey, if I sell an apple over here where everyone's selling them, I only get X dollars. But if I move a couple feet, I can sell for like twice as much, and so you do that, right? But that's not like a rate of an
Okay,
investment.
yeah, all right,
It's
that makes sense.
Well, there's monopoly profit, isn't there? That's a rate that you would not categorize as being a return on capital or labor or anything like that.
That's true. You could capitalize like a monopoly privilege, right? So like taxi medallions are kind of like that, right? Where they have like they are capital because they give you a return, right? Because
That's
you can
true.
change the supply.
It may not be so formalized though. Like you may just be that just the startup costs are very large. There may not be like a formal thing saying you have monopoly privilege. It may just be that there's
Seems like
a web of different barriers to entry.
those firms need to check their privilege.
One thing that's interesting, I wonder what the shape of the distribution is of changes in price. Like, or what is cost disease an abnormal phenomenon that we wouldn't expect just given the natural level of variation of all the factors that influence the changes of price of time? Or is this actually, we're just talking about the natural tail end of a normal distribution of changes of price?
Okay, well,
which either way, it's still an interesting question, but it's like it's different in nature depending on which.
I mean, that's kind of like a weird cop out, right? Because it doesn't talk about like the mechanism.
Well, no. It's definitely it's not a cop out, but like I said, it's an interesting question in either respect. But it affects what the question is, because if it is the tail end of a normal distribution, then what we would expect explains price increases in these extreme instances is just them having extreme values of the same factors which explain changes in price
I understand.
in general.
That makes sense.
Yes, yeah. So it changes the nature somewhat of the question, or the thoughts about it.
I do want to say though, we're getting close to the end of our time together here, unfortunately. But I do want to bring up one last topic to discuss here, and that's something I've been thinking about, which is basically it seems like the economic consensus, the neoclassical consensus, it seems at least in an abstract way to be relatively free market leaning, right? But if you look at most economists, they seem to be more left-leaning politically when it comes to actual like politics, like what kind of candidates do they support, than that would suggest. And obviously, this is substantially going to be influenced by just like tribal stuff. But what kind of surprised me is that even if you look at their views on specific issues, right? Like there's polls of economists. Like, I remember one that took me by surprise a lot, which is like, it was a poll of economists that asked, will Trump's decreases in the corporate tax rate like increase economic growth? And it was a surprising amount of economists who were surveyed here. Like, it was the majority of them said like probably not. And that really surprised me because, I mean, I literally have like, I know about like several specific papers that like, just empirically find that corporate tax rates are really bad for economic growth. And I mean, these are done by economists, right? Like, and this is not like a fringe view or something. As I understand it, this is basically the consensus. But then how is it that like in these polls, like they're asking like, is when Trump does, the corporate tax rate, is that going to be good? And they're like, no.
They should poll them to say when Cheeto Hitler lowers the tax rate, will growth increase?
I mean,
see what the results are.
This seems like a rather maybe an uncharitable explanation, I might say. But like, is it literally just because economists are blue tribe and they hear Trump and they just like have a strong bias to just say something bad about him? Like, and if we just like said like when Obama lowers the corporate tax rate, is that good? They would say yes. I mean, like that seems really like it's kind of cringy to even say that. But like, is that true?
Or it could be that the cuts are not large enough to influence growth.
I don't think that was the reasoning of the economists.
Once there's a situation such that most economists are to the left, obviously a sort of cycle happens, right, whereby they want to hire people to join the department who agree with them, and then that concentration becomes more and more and more like that. But I don't know. I don't. In social science in general, anyway, I don't remember the numbers for economics in particular, but in general, like a very large influence in terms of the left-wingedness of social sciences, and especially them in about the mid-20th century becoming so left-wing in the first place, is just the sheer number of Jewish people involved in those disciplines. And I know that
we're going there.
Are very heavily overrepresented among academic economists, especially in elite universities. And again, back in the 70s anyway, if you look at a lot of academic disciplines that are literally like their tilt to the left is mostly a function of the fact that they have lots of Jewish people in them.
Well, can I just point out that actually economics does not actually lean that strongly left. If I recall, there have been a few polls on how many economists say that they're, Republican or Democrat, and it basically comes out 2/3 Democrat, 1/3 Republican. So there's quite a significant number of right-leaning economists.
Right. I mean, it's relative to like other social sciences and relative to just like,
Yeah, I mean, in like psychology, it's like 9 or
sure.
In many disciplines, it's like 19-1.
Yes.
And maybe even higher than that.
Yes.
I think in psychology is maybe the ratio.
Well, even among the Democrat economics professors, I would suspect that they are more right-wing, as is traditionally defined, on economics than the average Democrat is.
Sure. I mean,
well, that is almost.
But it doesn't really explain. Like, I mean, I guess I'm asking a question that I guess we can't really answer, right? Because what I was talking about a specific thing, which was literally like, just I saw like a poll of like a bunch of economists that seemed to say like it wasn't like Democrat or Republican. It was a very specific position, like, no, Trump's tax cuts will not help us, right? And that contradicts what I understood to be just like the economic consensus. So I don't know.
And the thing is with growth rates is that they're kind of, I mean, they're such a macro thing that they may just be very difficult to influence.
Yeah, okay. That makes sense.
I mean, surely this is mostly just because of the leftist culture in academia that makes them oppose things that A, that Republicans do, and B, especially that someone like Trump does.
Right.
I mean, at least at the most proximal level, that is surely the cause. And I think if we ask why that culture is established in the first place, that there's plenty of data about that.
Okay. Well, with that anti-Semitic remark, I think we're gonna have to close the podcast. We're gonna have to shut it down, so to speak. Once again, I have been Chucky R. Law. With me today are, state your names.
Sean Last.
Prophet Maximizer.
And Gleason.
Okay. Well, thanks for coming on, everybody. That took you too long. You can write us an email at cursediscussions@gmail.com. I'm going to put this up on Pocket Cast through Anchor, and obviously subscribe to our YouTube, like us on Facebook and Twitter, suck my dick, and thanks for listening. Bye.
Sean. Like he can't help himself.
I even made a point to not call them Jews. I called them Jewish people.